What's up, guys? This is Nick from Arch City Poker, and in today's video, I'm going to be continuing the Let's Talk PLO series with today's topic covering basically just some hand reviews. About 3 hands that I'm going to go through pretty quickly to make for a short and efficient video for you guys. You guys can see some concepts, some PLO concepts that is, on full display here. So without further ado, let's get into the 3 hands. I have loaded them up into Poker Juice. So first hand, and these are all going to be from PLO 25 or just 25-cent PLO for you guys that are just beginning to get into PLO, or you consider yourself a little more novice or just getting to an advanced level. I think these stakes will have some players where these basic concepts will apply pretty well, and you guys can start to see what kinds of players you'll be up against, whether you play live PLO games or online. But anyway, let's get into the hand. So under the gun opens for pot and folds all the way to me in the big blind. This is a very weak queen's hand. This is not a hand that you should be 3-betting. It lacks playability post-flop. However, I have a pretty good concentration of equity with the queens and the queen high spades, as you guys can see with the 47% equity I have against his under the gun opening range, which I have at about 20% of hands. This player was opening a little bit wider than maybe your average player at these stakes or tighter players. Actually, I don't know, because I think average players in this pool seem to open actually a little bit more loose, so I think this is probably fine. But yeah, so I do go ahead and call. And flop comes 10-10-4 with 2 hearts. A flop that I think players will definitely be c-betting on. This player seemed to size his bets closer to pot, no matter the board texture. This is a spot where I think that's incorrect by him, because it's such a lockdown board for the most part that I think he just folds out a lot of the worst hands that he wants to call, possibly for this sizing, and I think that he's making his bluff a little more expensive when he doesn't need to. I think he can definitely c-bet something like $1 here, or 90 cents, and that would work pretty well, like something closer to half pot. So kind of interesting, but I do think that I'm doing well enough against his range, which I think a lot of it could be, I mean, he certainly can have better pairs, but he can have a lot of Miss Broadway stuff, maybe some rundowns that are, something like 9 high rundowns, or stuff like, 8-8, 7-5 type of stuff possibly. So I think I'm doing pretty well against this range where I need to at least peel and decide on the turn here. Turn brings a very interesting card. Brings in the Ace of Hearts. Certainly a card that I believe hits his range pretty well. I do have a pretty decent blocker in the Queen of Hearts here, that if I wanted to decide to turn my hand to a bluff either now or on the river, I think that's a pretty key card. But we'll see what ends up happening. So I check, and he checks behind, and this is going to be a little more player dependent. I don't know this player at all, so I think he could certainly check behind like a hand like Ace King here. I think that more often than not he's going to bet his boats. I think he might slow down with his 10x sometimes, but I think he might also bet it sometimes. So I think the check might take away some of his 10x. I think that he probably would bet a good amount of his flushes on this turn, but maybe not. So it's a really interesting spot. I think that a lot of players will maybe mix their strategies, but not understand why they're mixing them, and maybe not balance them real correctly. So without any knowledge of this player, I don't know how to quite take this. I think on the river, though, depending on what comes, I think a Jack or King would be a good card for me to possibly bluff. I think that any brick might be a decent possibility for me to bluff with the Queen of Hearts blocker, so we'll see what ends up happening. But river's pretty much perfect for me to decide to go ahead and bet here. And as you guys can see against his range, and I didn't mess around with it too much in Poker Juice's, in their settings down here, and I don't know if this is exactly correct, but I do think certainly that his under the gun opening range contains a lot of these kinds of cards. However, like I said, having the Queen of Hearts, and specifically having two queens in my hand, blocks the chance of getting looked up by some flushes. Definitely looks up, or definitely affects the chances of him having a straight that he could call with. I think this is a very profitable spot to go ahead and bluff with, obviously a very bad hand as far as absolute strength. But if you guys can get hands like trips to fold here that slow down on the turn, or, yeah, I would say trips. I think he could have a lot of ace king, a lot of ace queen type of stuff, even though I think if he had ace queen, he probably has some, jacks or kings or tens in his hand possibly. But nevertheless, I think this is a perfect spot with really good blockers to go ahead and fire and not go to showdown and lose to something like just an ace. I think that'd be really unfortunate, or even just like a king. So I think it's a really good spot to go ahead and definitely pull the trigger, and he did go ahead and decide to fold. So nice little hand to show some concepts of having a concentration of equity pre-flop when you're calling from the big blind. I think players overfold the big blind too often. I think that on the river also we saw the concepts of blockers, so I think very basic hand with some simple stuff, but I think it was a good one for you guys. Let's quickly move on to the next hand. So I'll just get right into the action. I open on the button with 8-7-5-5 single suit. I think it's a very good hand that I can open and then call against the 3-bet if that happens. Small blind calls, this is often going to be a pretty strong range, usually a pretty linear range of good rundowns, some Broadway type of stuff. So I think you'll see a lot of king-king and maybe incorrectly see some trashier queen-queen in here. So his range should be a little bit stronger though. Big blind goes ahead and decides the 3-bet. And I remember this player being a little bit more ABC, so I think his range is a little bit tighter here as far as his 3-betting range goes. So we'll go down here just for the sake of this. 3-bet out of position, and we'll give him something like 6%. I think that's probably about right. It's going to be very ace-ace heavy, essentially. He'll have some ace-king-king, maybe some ace-king-queen type of rundowns, but very well-connected stuff, a lot of his big pairs. So I think this hand plays pretty well against that range, though. And we have a lot of money behind, so I decided to go ahead and call. And very good flop, obviously. This flop texture should not smash his 3-betting range very hard. His best hands here are often going to be made up of ace-ace, king-king. It's essentially going to be overpairs with diamonds will be his absolute best hands. Yes, he could certainly have top set, but it won't be as often because he's just not going to be 3-betting a lot of his jack-jack types of hands unless it's specifically stuff like ace-ace, jack-jack, ace-king, jack-jack, ace-queen, jack-jack, and he just doesn't have those all that often compared to how often he has ace-ace and king-king in his hand. So whether to shove or peel here is very interesting. I could run it, but I've already run it, and I can tell you guys that Poker Juice thinks peeling's a little more profitable. I think you could argue it either way, but the one main thing when you're considering whether to peel and stack off on future streets or whether to just shove on the flop is SPR and then playability. Playability, I do have a good amount of it. I think there's pretty much no turn I can't commit to. Even diamond turns, just because of how low the SPR already is, I can pretty much commit profitably on any diamond turn, I believe. So I think I decided to go ahead and peel here. And the reason that I do this is, and like I said, I think shoving's totally fine. I think you get it in pretty well against his hands that are going to be calling off, but some players that are a little more straightforward, they may in fact not want to get their whole stack in here with like dry king-king, for example. And if a decently neutral turn comes, a turn card that doesn't really change too much about the board texture, which there are going to be a lot of those on this specific flop, and then a turn run out, I think that I'd rather him feel more comfortable with getting it in with that dry king-king, dry ace-ace, because I think with my hand, like I said, I think I have decent playability, and I'd rather keep him a little bit wider. So I think it's definitely arguable. I think it might be standard just to get it in here with this SPR. It's definitely about low enough to where it's fine. And on the turn comes a pretty fine card. Obviously I'm not the happiest when a diamond comes, but like I said, I can get it in. But this card's totally fine. I think I'm getting it in really good against his range now. And so I get it in. And I don't think it's going to show, unfortunately, what he had, but he ended up having ace-ace 4 deuce with no diamonds. So he had ace-ace with the gutter. That certainly makes a lot of sense, and I got it in very good versus range, but I think what to take away from this hand is just on the flop, peeling or stacking off is often going to depend on playability, what turns and rivers come that you can or cannot get it in on, and that will mainly depend on your SPR. If the SPR was a lot deeper, and that I think that'd make it a little less profitable to get it in on like turn diamonds. If the board was something like Queen Jack 5, that'd be a lot different because then he's going to have more gutters to the nuts, more ways he can make a better full house with his 2 pair combos on the flop. So I think it's an interesting spot, but a spot that I can show you guys where you are opening the button, calling profitably with a hand that has good visibility versus his range of, Broadway heavy stuff and more so high pair stuff than Broadway. And excuse the noise that just popped into the video, guys. That is a dehumidifier, unfortunately, and so I'm not close enough to where I can turn that off, but I think you guys can still hear me fine, so I apologize for that distraction. But yeah, I think that there's a couple good concepts in this type of hand, and whether to stack or peel off will depend on the few things I said. So I think it's an interesting hand, and hopefully one that you guys can take a little bit away from. The next one's going to be a similar type of hand, where the under the gun player, I believe, opens again. I'm going to go back to pre-flop here to show you guys. Yeah, so under the gun opens and gets forward to me in the big blind. If I was double suited, I think this would be a pretty decent spot to go ahead and 3-bet him, but single suit, I think it's fine to have this kind of hand in my range. Also, with how often I'm flatting from the big blind in this spot, I would like to have maybe a hand that can have decent board coverage as far as covering, these ace-high board textures. So I think this is totally fine. And end up flopping the nuts, but with no redraw. And this is an interesting spot because this is where this differs from the last hand where the SPR was around 4. I don't think it's super profitable to get it in here against his stack-off range. I think he's often going to have stuff like his worst hands that get it in here are going to be like King Jack with King High Spades, which has a good amount of equity versus me anyway. And that's going to be the bottom of his range. So hands that are getting it in very well against me are going to be like, sets plus, I guess stuff like, yeah, if he has like sets and like a redraw, or if he has even like the same Jack 10 but has spades, then he's doing really well against me. So with such a high SPR and just the bare nuts and decent playability on the turn, I think it's a nice spot to go ahead and check call. And I believe this is the same player that just fires close to pot when he bets. And I'm not saying he shouldn't here. It's a pretty dynamic board, so I think that makes sense, but I go ahead and call. And now when the SPR is a little bit lower and we get a pretty awesome turn, this changes pretty much nothing. In fact, will increase the equity of my hand against his range. I check, he bets pretty close to pot, and then I go ahead and able to get it in, and he folds. So interesting spot, again, to where we can talk about, and maybe not so much interesting, but just some more basic stuff as far as this Let's Talk PLO series for you guys. It's just a matter of what to take away from this is keep in mind SPR and playability. The lower the SPR is, the easier you can just stack off with hands that are stuff like the nuts on the flop, for example, with no redraw. But if you have a high SPR, you're going to want, hopefully, some kind of redraw with this. Yes, I did have middle pair, but as far as that goes, I would have to have like runner. A hand that I would get in here with the SPR of 13, as far as the Jack 10 hand, would be if I had spades with it, or if I had 2 pair with it. That's a little bit better scenario to where you're blocking sets, you have redraws to boats if you need it, or spades to free roll against your opponent. So I do think that that would work a little bit better. So you just want to be careful about understanding how you do against their stack-off range and what they're willing to get it in with so much money left behind. When the SPR is a lot lower, they're going to be willing to get it in lighter, and so you can widen your value shoving range. So if you guys have any questions or comments about the 3 hands that I went over, about any of the basic concepts that I discussed, go ahead and let me know in the comment section. Until next time, this is Nick from Arch City Poker. Take care, guys.